Hello grade 10s. In this video we will be talking about biodiversity and conservation. So biodiversity is short for biological diversity and can be broken down into three levels of consideration: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So genetic diversity uh, includes individual genetic variation within a population and between populations. So, for example, dogs have high genetic diversity. They come in a wide variety of sizes and shapes and different traits and things. Here's a photo of my dog, Phoebe. And it's also important to note that from dog to dog, at an individual level, and also looking at the entire population, uh, they vary greatly. So species diversity considers the number and relative abundance of species found in a given habitat. So here we have this forest, which also has high species diversity. You can see there's at least, I'd say probably at least 20 different species of plants just in view. High species diversity. And lastly, ecosystem diversity, which considers the variety of a biome's ecosystems. So you can see here, there's what looks like some sort of larger pond or the edge of a lake. There's a wetland of some kind, and then there's this grassy area. So there's different kinds of ecosystems within the biome, indicating high ecosystem diversity. So why should we care about biodiversity? Well, food, fiber, and medicine production rely heavily on biodiversity in nature, and many of these species are at risk in the wild. And by using species that exist in the wild in conjunction with species that humans use, uh, the species in the wild essentially act like a library, and we're able to adapt other species to suit our needs. So, for example, here's a photo of a species of rice that was almost nearly wiped out due to a virus. And so 7,000 different types of rice were tested to find one that could crossbreed with the species that was used for production here, which was Oryza sativa. And they eventually found Indian rice, or Oryza nirvana, was both able to cross with this species of rice, and it was resistant to the disease. So yeah, they were able to cross the two, and they were able to save the rice production. But they found that due to a loss of biodiversity, that a couple decades later, the Oryza nirvana, the wild variety that was resistant to the disease, was actually extinct in the wild. So ecosystem services, the benefits sustainable ecosystems provide that are experienced by living organisms, including humans. So some examples: plants take up carbon dioxide, release oxygen, and maintain soil fertility. Ecosystems cycle nutrients and help with and balance out the growth and decomposition cycle, provide habitat for the 2 million species on Earth, also a source of beauty and spirituality for many people. And ecosystems provide humans with food, timber, fossil fuels, and plants for medicinal purposes. So you can see here's a wheel with extra ecosystem services like water regulation, erosion regulation, soil formation, photosynthesis, aesthetics, recreation, food, all of those good things that we get from ecosystems. So, threats to biodiversity. The major one that is a huge issue is habitat loss. The IUCN estimates that 73% of species loss or at risk in the last few hundred years is due to habitat loss. Approximately 90% of tropical dry forest in Central America and Mexico has been cleared, mostly for cattle ranching. And so rainforests and dry forests in these areas, in the temperate areas of the world, are very rich in biodiversity, all three types of biodiversity. And yeah, to make way for cattle, a lot of this has been cleared, so a lot of species have been put at risk or are now extinct. So introduced and invasive species are another threat to biodiversity, as we talked about previously. So there are over 50,000 invasive species present in the United States. It costs billions of dollars annually to deal with the damages caused by these species. And so here's just an example. Here is the European starling, which was introduced in New York City in 1890. They were established in Central Park. There was a group that was really, really into this idea that all of the species that are mentioned in all of Shakespeare's plays should be introduced into Central Park in New York City. And as a result, the European starling has now become invasive, and there are over 100 million of these birds flying around North America. And as a result, due to competition and things like that, they have put many, many species of birds at risk. So overharvesting is another issue. So here is a large tuna species. Overfishing is a huge issue. Overfishing is an interesting one because it's kind of hard to determine how many of a given species are in the ocean. But generally the demand for fish is high, and that creates a want in people to overharvest these desirable species of fish. And they are a keystone species, and they play an important role in the ecosystem. And as a result, other species end up at risk due to the loss of these large species. And then in elephants, the ivory trade is a big issue as well. So people are typically kill elephants just for the ivory, and then the rest of the elephant just goes to waste. And so I believe this is a giant pile of confiscated ivory, as all ivory around the world needs to be registered in order to transport across borders, even in Canada too, and not necessarily just with elephants. Other species like narwhal, for example, they also have a tusk. That also needs to be registered in order to transport it around. So things like that have kind of helped protect these endangered species. So now we're going to shift and we're going to talk about conservation a bit. Conservation is kind of messy because there isn't a one-size-fits-all to protecting every species. Ecosystems, as we've talked about, are really complicated. There's a lot of factors. So it's important to come up with specialized solutions to solve every problem. So what is conservation? So conservation is the branch of ecology that deals with preservation and management of biodiversity and natural resources. So key factor in conservation uh, involves population monitoring. You can't come up with a good solution to help a population if you don't actually know how many members are in the population or have a rough estimate or have an idea of where the population lives. So, for example, we have over here on this side of the screen, we have a caribou that's wearing a monitoring collar. So these caribou, they are tranquilized in the wilds, and they have these remote collars put on them. And then there's just a little bit of an infograph of what happens. So the caribou is collared in the Northwest Territories using GPS. There's a satellite that sends a signal to the caribou's collar, and then it pings back to the satellite, and then that signal is relayed to a ground station, and then that data is then mapped and analyzed by biologists. So that's one way, especially helpful in tracking large animals that migrate around. Another solution to population monitoring is quadrant monitoring. So going out into the field, staking out the squares, and then determining what species are present or signs of species. So these are very small quadrants, but so the people monitoring these little squares will determine how many of certain species are in each square. So for example, here, there is one of these little, I'm not sure what kind of plant that is. And then, yeah, they would determine what is living in this area. So if we were looking at a forest, this can also be used on a larger scale. So for example, let's say this is a big forest, and each square represents 1 square mile. So rather than going out and counting the entire area, could determine which squares would be the best to survey. So say, for example, we surveyed this one, and then this one. And then go out, count the average of species or signs of species. So things like, if you're looking at mammals, things like footprints, poop, things like that. Anyways, right, so you would look at, say we did these 3 squares, and then we would take the average in each square and then multiply it by the total size of the area of the space to figure out how many of the target species are living in an area. So another key thing to consider when talking about conservation is maximum sustainable yield, which is the maximum level at which a natural resource can be routinely exploited without long-term depletion. Maximum sustainable yield is used to set limits for hunting, fishing, and forestry, and is usually about half of the carrying capacity. So if you remember, the carrying capacity is the total number of a population that an ecosystem can reasonably hold at a steady rate. So about half is the maximum sustainable yield. So that's how fishing limits are set, and hunting limits, and forestry limits. So for example, every year, if you're a hunter in Manitoba, you can hunt 1 deer, for example. But if it's determined that the population increased, occasionally that limit is raised to 2 deer a year instead, so that the population remains at a steady level. That way we're not decimating the deer population, and it's also not booming out of control. It could be a good way to protect biodiversity in an ecosystem. So ecotourism is tourism directed towards exotic, often threatened natural environments intended to support conservation efforts and observe wildlife. So A good ecotourism organization will minimize physical, social, behavioral, and psychological impacts, build environmental and cultural awareness and respect, provide direct financial benefits for conservation, deliver memorable interpretive experience to visitors that helps raise sensitivity to host countries' political, environmental, and social climates, design, construct, and operate low impact facilities, and recognize the rights and spiritual beliefs of Indigenous people in your community and work in partnership with them to create empowerment. So it's important to realize that today, ecotourism is kind of this popular thing. It's kind of hot right now. So a lot of organizations, unfortunately, don't follow these values. So if you are participating in ecotourism, which I highly recommend that you do, a lot of these experiences are really cool. So take a step back and ask yourself, are these things happening? Is the organization helping the local community? Are they low impact? Are they considering the impact they're having on the species that they're protecting? Or are they just looking for financial gain? But ecotourism, if done correctly, is a great way to help promote conservation. So, low genetic diversity. So some species with low genetic diversity are crossbred to improve their chance of survival as a species. So for example, here we have a photo of a North American bison. In the 17 and 1800s, the bison were overhunted almost to extinction. So what happened was the genetic diversity was very low in the bison that were remaining. So what happened was most of the bison that were left, they were crossed with cattle, and that they were able to raise the population, one, and two, they were able to prevent inbreeding in the population and improve the overall health of the herd. So kind of interesting, but now if you eat bison meat, it's likely actually a bison cow cross, kind of like this guy here. You can kind of see, looks a little bit more like a cow, whereas this one looks more like pure bison. So protected lands and nature reserves. Nature reserves are good in theory, however, unfortunately, they are not always good in practice. So most people that make decisions at nature reserves, they have good intentions, but they necessarily don't practice the best methods in terms of conservation. So for example, here we have a native tall prairie grassland. And so one of the big things when dealing with tall prairie grassland is that fire is an inevitable thing, and it actually helps the ecosystem when it's done timely. So every, I think it's 5 years or so, it's natural for a fire to rip through. You can see here actually this area is a prescribed burn management zone. And there are species that will only pop up and thrive if they're left after a fire has ripped through, and if not, if human intervention prevents fire and other disturbances to move through an ecosystem as they would naturally, other species can totally overtake the ecosystem and the biodiversity can drop right down. And so another issue with nature reserves is space. So predators like this lovely grizzly bear here require a lot of space. They move around, and unfortunately, a lot of reserves just don't have the space to properly hold a grizzly bear. So there's often a lot of roaming, an issue with buffer zones, and inevitably human intervention. And so here's just a little graphic about nature reserves and land use. So, a bigger size is better, less edge is better. You can think here a grizzly bear isn't necessarily going to know that it can only walk back and forth. It's going to meander around in whatever way it wants to go. So, in theory, an area with less edge is better. Clusters work better. Yeah, a grizzly bear wouldn't know that it would need to pop along. And habitat corridors are good, so allowing species to go in and out of various habitat fragments. So talking a little bit about habitat corridors, this was a solution that was put in place in Banff National Park. So in Banff National Park, you may or may not have had the chance to visit, but there is a highway that runs through to get to Banff from Calgary, and then it goes up through Jasper and then swings over towards Edmonton. But so these areas, this on the left isn't a map of Banff, but it's just as an example. So there is, you can see in this photo actually, there's a large fence that goes all the way along the highway to protect the wildlife. However, that also separates the species that live in the park. So there may be breeding pairs that live on this side and on this side, and that can create a whole bunch of problems when they're not able to intermingle. So in Banff National Park, these habitat corridors were built. So you can see the cars go under, and then the animals are able to cross over, and there's vegetation all along, and they've actually shown to be effective. After they are opened, it does take a while for the larger predators to go across, but eventually over time it does happen. So it's pretty neat. And so another solution to a conservation issue. So this is Robert Terreur. He lives in Kenya. At the time, he was 12 years old. His family owns a cattle ranch on the border of a national park in Kenya. And so they were having issues with lions attacking their livestock at night. So the normal solution to this would be to shoot the lions if they came onto their property. But Robert came up with this solution to install these lion lights. So it's these lights. They're attached to solar panels along the entire perimeter of the fence. And so the lion gets too, and they're attached to motion sensors. So a lion gets too close to one of the motion sensors, and these bright lights go off in the middle of the night, and the lion is scared away. And then that way, the cattle were experiencing less predation, and the lions were subsequently not shot as a result. So, pretty creative solution for a 12-year-old boy. It's pretty neat. So the daily questions for today: make a list of 10 ecosystem services provided by forests. Number 2, why should we care about protecting biodiversity? And number 3, a new species of endangered bird is discovered in the Interlake. How could we protect it? Describe at least 3 possible ways.